We begin with an historical glimpse at a North St. Louis County suburb that's gained international notoriety after the fatal shooting of an African-American teenager by a white police officer. Ferguson is not unlike many other American cities that have grappled with issues of race. And as was the case with other cities that have experienced civil strife, Ferguson has the wherewithal to heal and move forward.
1880, no, it hadn't been incorporated yet, and we didn't have like street addresses or anything like that.
Ruth Brown, whose grandfather settled in Ferguson in the 1880s, knows more than most people about the early days of this city. She's on the board of the Ferguson Historical Society. I met her at one of several homes built by physician Dr. George Case for his family.
At his own expense, from the train depot up to his house, which is directly behind us, and along this street here, before we had street lights or anything like that, he had kerosene lamps installed on poles up there so that his family and friends could have better light.
Ferguson was incorporated in 1894. It was first marketed to St. Louisans as a place to build vacation homes, then as a commuter suburb.
By 1904, during the World's Fair, Ferguson had 42 commuter trains a day going to and from St. Louis. We were the first leg of that commuter line that went out to St. Charles. That was completed in 1856. They also, by the World's Fair time, had like 4 theater trains a week and special trains for social events down in St. Louis. So we were called the Queen City of the Wabash for a while because there was such a strong connection with Ferguson.
January Wabash Park and the street on which it sits is named for the January family. The home of patriarch, businessman, and slave owner Thomas January once stood here, where Ferguson Middle School is now located.
He worked for the, I believe it was Meridosa and Illinois Railroad before he came over here. And in 1842, he bought his property knowing that the railroad, then the North Missouri Railroad, was looking for a commuter line between St. Louis and St. Charles. And so he bought a big hunk of land somewhere between the two, and with the anticipation, he was also on the site and construction committee of that railroad, which later became the Wabash Railroad. So he had some say in the matter of exactly where the route went and so forth.
Following the end of the Civil War, January freed his slaves and deeded them land north of his estate on 2 adjoining streets, here on Albert Avenue and a stone's throw away on Eddy.
Part of the provisions of the State Emancipation Proclamation was that land be granted to slaves and a way to make a living. They built one of the earliest churches in the area, Mount Olive Baptist Church.
I wonder how many of you in this audience remember this old wood burner with its antique rolling stock, coal oil lamps, and wooden coaches.
This promotional film from the early 1930s, paid for by the local bus company and auto repair shop, shows no indication blacks ever set foot in Ferguson. As was the case throughout the St. Louis area, neighborhoods and schools were segregated. On the day of the funeral for Michael Brown, the African-American teenager shot to death by a white Ferguson police officer, we paid a visit to someone whose historical perspective on race relations in Ferguson is very personal.
Early on in KINLOCH, we had a doctor out there, we had a dentist, we had a furniture store.
78-year-old Joseph Wells is a native of KINLOCH, the oldest community in Missouri incorporated by African Americans. It's also adjacent to Ferguson. Wells once served as KINLOCH's mayor, and was the first black to be elected to the Ferguson-Florissant School District Board of Education. He grew up at a time when Ferguson was referred to as a sundown town.
As kids, we used to go over there to cut grass, make money, make us a little money. And but we had to make sure we was out of there before the sun went down, because they didn't want no blacks in Ferguson with the sun down. If you did, the police would just take you and lock you up, and wasn't nothing you could do about it, They just make it hard on your parents because they want you to pay a fine to get out, and all that.
This is Suburban Avenue. It runs along the southern borders of Ferguson and KINLOCH. Joseph Wells remembers the days when a streetcar line ran along here. But in 1975, after the streetcars gave way to motor vehicle traffic, a Ferguson city councilman went to great lengths to stop the flow of traffic between the two communities.
And Ferguson blocked the street off, put stones and bricks and all that. I mean, big heavy things. You need a crane or something to move them with, across there.
He wanted to build a 10-foot tall chain link fence all along the border between Ferguson and KINLOCH. Well, exactly in the 1970s, you've got to be kidding, right? He was an extremist, and he put up a barricade down when the street pavement went through, but he didn't want any traffic coming through. The mayor of KINLOCH had requested that be opened up and for better access for KINLOCH residents. Our mayor knew that was the only thing to do.
Author and historian Dr. John Wright.
Many of the people who lived around Ferguson are still alive who were born and lived during the Jim Crow era of Ferguson. Many of them have moved into Ferguson. With them also, they took with them the stories. And they have children, and if they're being harassed by the police, those stories keep popping up. And as a result of that, they won't die.
The St. Louis region's history of race relations has included a few grim chapters, most notably the 1917 East St. Louis race riot that targeted African Americans. At least 39 blacks and 8 whites were killed. But there are a number of examples in which St. Louis has led the way in advancing civil rights.
All of these are photographs that relate to civil rights in St. Louis.
Gwen Moore is curator of urban landscape and community identity at the Missouri History Museum. She's currently working on an exhibit scheduled to open in September of 2016 with the working title, St. Louis, #1 in Civil Rights.
We have a long history, a long civil rights history. The first sit-ins were in 1942 probably, but in 1944 there were sit-ins here. There was a group called the Citizen Civil Rights Committee that was a coalition of groups, black and white groups. And the NAACP, the March on Washington movement, I think the ACLU was involved. We had a very rich civil rights movement. We had a very long civil rights movement. But our circumstances were different from the circumstances in Mississippi or Alabama or Georgia. For one, blacks could vote here. That was never an issue. After the 15th Amendment, we voted. We didn't have to pass a law to vote. We didn't have grandfather clauses. We didn't have literacy tests. We didn't have poll taxes. All the kind of things that were happening in other places where they tried to prevent blacks from voting or suppress the vote. So that didn't happen here. So that was an outlet that we had here that they maybe didn't have in Mississippi.
I would forgo the liquid smoke.
Really, I didn't like the flavor.
If you're going to do that, then get the pit going for just for a half hour or so.
Really?
Just put a little smoke on it, then put it in the oven.
The advice on meat preparation is courtesy of Gary Crump. He's the owner of Paul's Market in Ferguson, founded in 1959 by Crump's father, Paul.
And there's the two. That's the old building right here with the meat counter. Could you imagine that?
Crump's award-winning third-generation family business is deeply woven into Ferguson's cultural fabric. It draws customers who come to connect with neighbors as much as they do to shop. And it's that kind of old school community engagement that could lead Ferguson to a promising future.
We have to keep doing what we're doing, and we have every individual who lives in this community, every individual who lives in this county, every individual who lives in this state. We have a choice to make. How are you going to improve yourself to improve your neighbor?
What's going on? How you doing today? I'm thinking.
Our churches have to get more involved. We just can't worship. Jesus said, get out among the people.
Joseph Wells says, get out to the polls.
It is 100% the most important tool we have is voting. And I don't care how you get out and how you scream and tell people to vote and say, well, it's not going to make no difference no way. That's not true. You've got to get out and vote.
My mother-in-law used to have a saying that old age isn't for sissies. And I think we could say diversity is like old age. It is not for sissies. And I think it's something we all have to work at very hard, knowing that every person deserves respect and manners and is as good and worthy as you are.